Paul the Apostle was often in trouble. He was a rather controversial person, seeming to always find one person or another to conflict with. You might know that I'm having trouble getting this to work. Any technical people up here? Rashad, Carrie? Because I don't see anything happening. Refresh. That one? Reload site. Okay. Sorry, folks. Well, you got the message on mine. Well, I better say something. All right. We'll just forget about this. Fine. Maybe I didn't push that button. Well, okay. Maybe we're on. Go live. Here we go. Try again. I apologize for not being technically adept. It just seems that, and here it's gone again. Okay. Now I'm going to get my message, and I don't know whether this is going to be broadcast live streaming or not, and that's the way it goes, because it's the best I can do. We'll leave it up to Carrie to get this happening. I think he's going to do it on his phone there. Okay. So turn to Romans chapter 13, please. Romans chapter 13. We are studying the teachings of a person known through history as Paul the Apostle. That was what he was called, not initially, but as he was serving the king. His name did not change from Saul, which is what his given name was, to Paul. It was only because Paul was a Greek name, Paulus, and so when he went into the Greek world, it was more comfortable for the Greek-speaking people to use Paul rather than Shaul. Shaul was his Hebrew name. Last time I shared with you before, my Hebrew name is Baruch. But in America, that's hard for people to say. Am I right? Baruch. Can you say that? Baruch. You see what I said? Yeah, it's hard. It's got that guttural chet at the end, and it's difficult. So all Jewish people around the world have two names. A given name for boys when they have their circumcision, their bris, and it's usually in Hebrew, and for girls at another time in their life, but always a name that's popular in the countries in which they live. So here, Rabbi Shaul became known as Paul, and his title was the Shaliach, or in Greek, the Apostle. So why do we study him? Why do we read his letters like Romans and Ephesians and Galatians? Because the Messiah himself identified him as one of his key apostles, one of his key shlichim, one of his key people that was going to go out and tell the world about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and his Messiah. So that's why we study Paul, and I want to tell you that Paul was a controversial person. Back in his days, as we learned from our study of the book of Galatians, the letter that he wrote to these people living in Galatia, which is now Asia Minor, there were some zealous Jewish people who started preaching that for a non-Jew to be saved, that means a child of the king, they had to convert to Judaism first. In other words, they could not become followers of Yeshua. Nowadays, the term is Christian, often used. I don't like that term because it doesn't exactly say what we mean by it. A lot of different Christians, Seventh-day Adventists, Catholics, Mormons, are all called Christians. In fact, in the Jewish world, it's either us Jews and everybody else who are called Christians. So it's a difficult term for people to understand, so I don't like to use it. But in his day, the people that were followers of the Messiah, it was told by some people, had to become Jewish first, which for men meant an operation. Nothing more would be said. So he was a person who said, no, I don't think that that's the nature of things. I don't think that a person has to become a Jew before he can follow Yeshua. And he took a stand against some of the other Jewish people who said they got to convert to Judaism first. Peter was one of those. And Paul took a stand against Peter about that, as you read in Galatians. Lisa, honey, please give me a glass of water. Thank you. So anyway, Paul was often unpopular. He also continued to tell non-Jews that they had to learn from the Jews, because the Jews were given the prophets, the patriarchs, the promises of God, and God gave to the Jewish people an awful lot of information that he wanted the Jewish people to share with the non-Jews. So here, Paul has to tell his Gentile friends they got to start paying more attention to learning from the Jewish people and giving up some of their old, very, very pagan ways. The Gentiles in the time of Rome were living very pagan lives. So now, Paul is saying to the Gentiles, hey, thank you. He's saying, hey, you got to give up those Gentile ways. Now, I don't have anything against Gentiles, neither does God, but the Gentiles in those days were equal to pagans, not just non-Jews. They were really over the top against the ways of God. So Paul was unpopular with the Jews because he confronted Peter with this issue, and then he was unpopular with the Gentiles. So when we come to his letter to the Romans, he was used to telling people the truth. For those of you older people, you might remember a great sports announcer, Howard Cosell. He used to say, what did he say? What? A little louder? Tell it like it is, right. So that was Paul's nature. He told it like it is. And here in Romans, he's doing the same thing. He didn't use this letter to the Romans to just make nice on the people and just tell them how wonderful they were and how God loved them and everything. He confronted them because they needed to be confronted. They needed to hear the truth. So he was not a popular person. He was a very controversial person. But we study him anyway because we want to learn what he said to the Romans and see if there's anything in that for us. And I say there is. Now, having just described in last week's message, the behavior of a believer was needed to manifest in a local congregation. Remember, that was all about how to behave in your local synagogue. That was what we talked about. Finding your place in your local community, serving there faithfully, respecting the structure, etc., etc. Now he's turning to how a person with a renewed mind, remember everybody who became a believer had what was called a renewed mind, and Paul challenged them to keep renewing their mind. But these people with renewed minds now, how were they to function in secular society? How were people to function in secular, that is, Roman society? Very important question. The way it relates to us is how are we, who are children of heaven, supposed to function in our society here today? That's the practice. That's what we're trying to learn. So, Rabbi Shaul explains that a person in society needs to have a high view of something called, are you sitting down? Authority. It's not a popular word in our day. Authority is a loaded word in our day. We live in a world where you hear expressions like, do your own thing, or you challenge authority. Even, I'm going to do it my way. We know this, right? This is the common mood of the world. To do it not God's way, do it my way. So there was an issue of challenging authority. In Paul's day, this was especially prevalent because the governmental authority wasn't coming from Jewish leadership. It was coming from Roman leadership. So here Paul, a Jew, talking to a group of Jews and Gentiles living in a Roman-dominated society, had to talk to his friends of what to do. Well, how do you survive? What do you do? Because the Romans, for the most part, were very much against the Jews maintaining identity. If you want to know something, the Romans came up with this idea called crucifixion. Now, crucifixion is about the worst way you could be executed. Awful. So when we think about Yeshua's crucifixion, we have to remember when he was willing to go through that for us, it was a real demonstration of his love for each one of us. Crucifixion was horrible. The Romans invented it. So there were many good reasons for Paul's hearers, Paul's readers, to fear authority, to rebel against authority, because authority to them could have led to their death. So they needed to figure it out. So first, Paul introduces some principles of authority that I'm going to share with you now. Principles of authority from Romans 13, 1 and 2. Everyone is to obey the governing authorities, for there is no authority that is not from God, and the existing authorities have been placed where they are by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities is resisting what God has instituted, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. I told you Paul was controversial. His readers are hearing, they think he's saying to them that they should submit to the Roman authorities. Not the Jewish authorities, but the Roman government. Frightening thing. Thus far in Rome, Paul describes God in authoritative terms here in Romans. He's saying that God is sovereign. It was his authoritative word that created the universe. Don't you think that the entity that created the universe should have some authority over the universe? You would think so. If you happen to build cars, from spare parts, if you have that ability, and you built that car, you should have some authority on who drives that car. If I built a car, I'd never let anybody drive it but myself, because somebody would be bound to mess it up. So God has to exert authority over his creation. The only thing created that did not submit to his authority was Hasatan, the Satan, the evil, the adversary. He, from the get-go, did not submit to God's authority. This even led to what Paul wrote in Romans 8:22, which we looked at a couple weeks ago. Paul wrote, "We know that until now, till that moment, the whole creation has been groaning as with the pains of childbirth." That's the way Paul described the situation in his day. The creation was groaning like it was in childbirth. Thankfully, I've never been through childbirth. I've seen it. It does not look like a fun thing. Some of you ladies are laughing. You're having great memories, I'm hoping. I heard that once women have the baby, they can't remember the pain. Is that true? You've had a few. It's true. Well, see, that's good. Whew. Anyway, that's the way Paul describes the situation in the world today. Back in his day, and I say it's even worse today. It's like childbirth, very painful. And that is still a result of the rejection of God's authority by our first mother. We all have the first mother, right? Her name was Chava, or Eve. She was the mother of us all. And she chose to disregard God's authority. And what did he say to her? "I will greatly increase your pain in childbirth. You will bring forth children in pain. Your desire will be for your husband, but he will rule over you." Talk about groaning. God's going to increase the pain of women because of Eve's sin? Afraid so. Afraid so. Thankfully. As Sammy just said, the pain doesn't last forever, at least the memory of it, right? Phew, that's good. When God created everything, childbirth, in my opinion, was not meant to be painful. Think about that. If pain in childbirth came because of Chava's sin, then you have to think that when God created procreation, childbirth was not meant to be painful. I think it was meant to be pleasant. But something happened. Sin entered the world. And that's where Paul is seeing things now. Of course, the rebellion of Eve was not just her fault. Her husband got involved too. Adam, he messed up good. So early on in Scripture, we see what happens when humans go against the revealed word from above. But there's even more to consider. The rebellion against God has led to awful situations in our world today. From horrendous hurricanes to vicious volcanoes, to famine, plague, and pestilence, to AIDS, perverse ideas of sexuality, real racism, anti-Semitism, and a host of other horrible ways in our world today. And it all began because Adam and Eve did not submit to the authority of the Creator, the authority of the King. I want to say that I don't believe God's perfect plan was for that to happen. When God created the heavens and the earth, what did he say? It was all good. Not just good, very good. Tov ma'od, it says in Genesis. God created this great creation to be a wonderful place, and it didn't take long because of Adam and Eve's rebellion against God's authority that sin came into the world. So, everywhere the great apostle teaches that God delegated his authority to parents, employers, elders, husbands, but his emphasis here is on the role of government in the Roman society. In other words, civil law. So Paul makes the point that one of the key principle of authority is all authority comes from God, and God delegates it to whoever he wishes. He delegated judgment to Yeshua, right? And he delegated authority to elders and parents, teachers, judges, and so forth and so on. And it's all the way civilization works. In light of the exalted position of divinely appointed secular authorities, okay, divinely appointed secular authorities. Do you hear what I'm saying? Secular authorities, Roman government, American government are divinely appointed. Keep that in mind. A believer needs to subject himself or herself to such authorities as unto God. Remember, authorities are divinely appointed by God, and we are called to submit to them. A believer's ability to do that is an indication of how renewed his or her mind really is. If a person is a believer and is rebelling all the time, the question I would ask, is their mind being renewed at all? But the person whose mind is being renewed day to day, as Yeshua tells us to do, or Paul wrote about last week, is somebody we can see the nature of God in. The preamble of the United States Constitution, which I'm sure all of you memorized in high school, probably don't even teach anymore, do they, in high school? I don't think they teach. They teach government carry.
Yes,
they do.
We teach
they teach
government.
the preamble of the Constitution.
Yes.
I'm going to repeat it for those of you who have forgotten it since high school. The preamble to the United States Constitution states that the government was created in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, to ordain and establish a Constitution for the United States of America. The preamble, the prelude, is saying that the Constitution was formed for all these good things. All these laws were formed and created for very good things. Provide domestic tranquility, that means peace, the common good, etc., etc. So a main principle of authority is that all authority comes from God, which I should indicate doesn't mean that we need to submit to authorities that go against the will of God. I want to clarify. If you were in Germany in the 40s and 50s, or the 30s and 40s, and the Nazis were telling you to kill Jews, you don't have to submit to that kind of authority. That causes you to go against the will of God. But all authorities that come from God are to be submitted to. Those who are not from God, maybe a usurped authority, like Satan, we don't submit to them. The challenge, of course, is to have the ability to exercise discernment so we know who is speaking from God and who is not. Sometimes people talk like they're from God, they're speaking for God, but they're really not. So you have to be discerning about these matters. So the first principle of what Paul is telling us about authority is that God is the authority of all. Now Paul turns now to back. He talked about the principle, now he's going to talk about the purpose of authority. The next few verses provide some of the basis for the United States Constitution, actually. They explain why it's a good thing to have government, not too much of it, but enough to create good things. Verse 3, for rulers are no terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you like to be unafraid of a person in authority? Then simply do what is good and you'll win his approval. Paul is saying, recognize that submitting to authority is good for you. If you have a job and you rebel against your boss, it's not going to be good for you. It's better to submit to your authority. It's going to be better for you. You'll get a raise. Those of you who have never gotten a raise, you might ask yourself, are you submitting to authority? Are you listening to your boss? Or are you rebelling against your boss? It's an issue. For the boss, the person in authority is God's servant, there for your benefit. But if you do what is wrong, be afraid. Because and he's speaking about the Romans here. Because it is not for nothing that he holds the power of the sword. For he is God's servant there as an avenger to punish wrongdoers. So governmental authority is set up for good purposes. We need to be grateful for that. Clearly, Paul is presenting an argument for submitting to rulers, people in authority, because it makes your life better, safer, and that person is there as a servant of God as well. And that person who's in authority over you, whether a rabbi, a boss, a teacher, a president, a senator, has to give an answer also to the one with all the power, the God of Israel, someday. In such a society where the rule of law is enforced, people can live safer lives, better lives. Human authority plays an important role in evaluating man's behavior, either good or bad. God delegated this job, this operation, to human authorities and requires human authorities to deal with those who need to be disciplined. Now, I don't know about you, but it's a very rare occasion that I've ever heard of when a person gets a traffic ticket and turns to the policeman and says, I'm so thankful that you have authority. Now, I'm not saying I've ever gotten a traffic ticket, but I'm just going to imagine, had I done this, and maybe I wasn't feeling that spiritual that day, I might have said something else to the policeman. Not really. But can you imagine? Here's a policeman who's got a job to do. He's been given authority to keep the roads safer, and he arrests somebody, he pulls somebody over, and gets nothing but grief for doing so. The really spiritual person stays quiet, accepts the ticket, pays it, admitting guilt, assuming the person was speeding. And I'm not saying any of you have ever been in that situation, but it might have happened. You see, there are sometimes excesses in governments like Iraq, Uganda, Iran, even Venezuela. And it's a time to not submit to authority. For the most part, we are called to follow the laws of a community, the laws of a congregation, the laws of a corporation, and the laws of a country in order to function effectively and efficiently. So the next time we get pulled over for a speeding ticket, if that should ever happen to anybody here, which I doubt, we can bow our heads and thank God that we live in a society with a good government and not in a place of terror where there's dictatorship, socialism, or anarchy. We happen to live in a great country with a great government. Not perfect, but a great place to live. You know that. We may complain, but we know. Just look around the world and think about where you would prefer living. It's a great country. Good government is good for its citizens. Corrupt government is not. Paul continues in verse 5. Another reason to obey. because besides fear of punishment from whoever, is for the sake of our own conscience. This is why you pay taxes, for the authorities are God's public officials constantly attending to these duties. Pay everyone what he is owed. If you owe the tax collector, pay your taxes. If you owe the revenue collector, pay revenue. If you owe someone respect, pay him respect. If you owe someone honor, pay him honor. He's saying, be obliged to do what the right thing is to do. Fear, he says, is a great motivator. But a believer is best motivated by respect for authority as a matter of conscience, not as a matter of avoiding punishment. But as we grow, that becomes more likely. When we're young, we need to understand punishment. We need to understand parental authority. And sometimes the only way to get that through is through what's called discipline. You know the proverb, spare the rod, spoil the child. Hopefully, when the child manages to grow up, no more need for the rod, because everything has been safely done. Most of us enjoy living in this great country that has provided fairly safe living for most people, adequate sources of food and water, and opportunity to succeed in life. Granted, some have had it easier than others, but overall, everyone has a fair shot at the American dream. I know this is debatable, but take, for example, the Home Depot. Don't you love the Home Depot? I saw an interview with the previous owner, one of the owners of the Home Depot on TV last week. Both his parents were low-wage earners. He did not come from wealth. He came from poverty, actually. But because he understood the American dream, he built an organization that now has over 300,000 employees, according to my research. Can you imagine running a company of 300,000 people? Or 30. 300,000 people. And guess what? He said in the interview, 3,000 of these people were millionaires. And the average wage is $262,000 a year. I'm going to get applications for the Home Depot for all of us. It's a great company, and it takes good care of its people. Good authority can do great things. Had the owners of this company not believed in the American dream, confusion and catastrophe and chaos would have taken place, because they would not have built an authority structure that could handle running an organization with 300,000 people. It cannot be done haphazardly. Thank God for authority. Not to beat this up, but Venezuela used to be one of the wealthiest countries in the world only a few years ago. With less than 10 years ago, it was wealthy. Had a huge amount of oil. But a dictator took over. Next thing you know, the country went socialist, which sounded good on paper, but now the country is destroyed. I'll tell you how bad it is. People are using toilet paper, are using paper currency for toilet paper because they can't get toilet paper. I'll tell you how bad it is in Venezuela now. People are eating their pets. And less than 10 years ago, it was a wealthy, wealthy, wealthy country, but it got a bad leader in there. And we know what happens now. A lot of this is due to the government being corrupt and not following the ways of God's authority structure. And that's what we need to be concerned about. For our country, we have a good government. Things are going great for most of the people in the country. Not perfect. Well, we need to commit to making them better, not overthrow the government. I know that's not going to happen. Well, I don't know it's not going to happen. Paul supports government and governmental systems, especially when they're good governments. He began his chapter discussing principles of authority, explaining that all authority comes from above. He went on to explain the purpose of authority, essentially to provide peace in societies, congregations, homes, and so forth. Now he's going to offer some practical observations about authority as he turns his attention to some personal considerations. Verse 8. Don't know anyone anything except to love one another. For whoever loves his fellow human being has fulfilled the Torah. For the commandments, don't commit adultery, don't murder, don't steal, don't covet, and any others are summed up in this one rule: love your neighbor as yourself. His first personal application, his first personal observation is we must learn to love one another. That's the top priority in anything that we do. Love is a theme throughout the entire Bible. It's a concept that is discussed by philosophers, written about by poets and songwriters. It's on the minds of most people most of their time. Is somebody going to love me? How am I going to learn to love somebody that I don't love? It's a very important issue in our lives. So Paul says the bottom line is learn how to love somebody, because that fulfills don't commit adultery, don't murder, don't steal, the 10 Commandments, and all the other laws. They're all subsumed under the message, love your neighbor as yourself. God is love. Love does no harm to a neighbor, therefore love is the fullness of the Torah. So Paul's first personal observation is that all believers need to learn how to love one another. And loving people is, he said, a debt. What do we owe? A debt to people to love them. Look around this room. What kind of love have you shown people in this room? Or at your home, in your home, or at your place of business, or at your school? We as believers, we as children of God, have been given the great gift of riches beyond measure in eternity. We've got it all, folks. We need to learn how to share that and love other people. Love requires action. Love your neighbor as yourself. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Don't do unto others what you don't want them to do to you. Torah is God's law. Torah is God's law of life, not a burden, but a blessing. And the whole 613 commandments are subsumed in the expression, love your neighbor as yourself. Just like when we plant a tomato, we're not going to get a pumpkin. Or when we plant a cucumber, we're not going to get an onion. But when we plant a squash, we're going to get a squash, not a pumpkin, not a potato. We're going to get a squash when we plant a squash. It's called natural law. God created natural law. If we do things the way God instructed, we'll have success. It's natural law. These are the laws of the Almighty. And one of the laws of the Almighty is for us to love one another. There's great fruit that come to us when we love somebody else. It's the way humans were designed to be. Paul concludes this section with the point, love does not harm a neighbor. A neighbor doesn't mean just somebody living next door. A neighbor can be anyone with whom we relate. And in this way, the love way, we're fulfilling all the laws found in the Torah. Why? God is love. So Paul's first personal observation about authority is that God authorizes us to have and to give love. His second personal observation about authority is that the time is getting short, so get busy for God. Verse 11. Chapter 13, verse 11. Besides all this, you know at what point in history we are now. He wrote that 1950 years ago. So it is high time for us to rouse ourselves from sleep, for the final deliverance is nearer than when we first came to believe. Remember, he wrote that a long time ago. I think we're closer to the final deliverance now than then. He says in verse 12, the night is almost over. The day is almost here. So let us put aside the deeds of darkness and arm ourselves with the weapons of light. If this word is true, and I believe it is, We're much closer to the end of days than we were when Paul wrote. In theological circles, they use the Greek word parousia, meaning the second coming, the unveiling, the revelation. We're much closer to the return of the Messiah than we were before. I'm serious. One of these days, we might meet the Messiah face to face here on earth. And so, Paul says, get busy. Folks, you and I as believers in Yeshua are in the boat. Like the days of Noah, when he heeded the Lord and built an ark, while many people stood around and mocked him, made fun of Noah. Can you imagine building a boat in a desert that's never had rain, that didn't even know what a flood was? I mean, conceptualize Noah. God says, Noah built an ark, and unlike what Bill Cosby said, he didn't say what's an ark. Remember that story? That was a great comedy bit from Bill Cosby. What's an ark? No, he set about to build an ark. I don't think I see anywhere in the Bible where he said, God, what are you talking about, build an ark? I can do it, but there's no water, there's no rain. Are you crazy? I got a life to lead. There's all kinds of reasons he could have objected to have doing this, but he did it. He built an ark and he got in it with his family, and they were rescued. Folks, the ark now is in Yeshua. Can we think of just one person in our lives to whom we could say one thing about the Messiah that might draw them closer? I want you to think about this. One thing you could say to one person to draw that person closer to the Messiah. What can you say? Think about it. Can you say to them, did you know that God loves you? Is that doable? I mean, think about it. Can you go to somebody and say, oh, by the way, I meant to tell you, God loves you. Did you know that? Can we say something like that? We have no idea what kind of impact that would have on people. Because a lot of people walk around feeling terribly unloved. And if you share the love of God with somebody, it's a great act and will help them get into the salvation boat. Because the time really is short. We need to act because the day of the Lord is coming soon. And Paul had one more personal observation about authority that I'll share with you, that we need to submit our ways to him, particularly because the time is short. Messiah is waiting to take up residence on the earth. He will rule from the city of peace, Jerusalem. That's where he'll set up kingdom. So he says in verse 13, let us live properly, as people do in the daytime, not partying and getting drunk, not engaging in sexual immorality and other excesses, not quarreling and being jealous. Instead, clothe ourselves with the Lord Yeshua the Messiah, and don't waste your time thinking about how to provide for the sinful desires of your old nature. In other words, make a decision. Make a decision to focus on the right things, not the wrong things. Focus on the Messiah. Philippians says, think on the lovely things, not the awful things. It's a matter of our focus, folks. We tend to become submitted to that which owns us. If we love to get drunk, alcohol owns us. If we love to engage in sexual immorality, sex outside of marriage will affect our lives. If we're always arguing with someone or finding ourselves jealous of somebody, there won't be much time in our lives or emotional strength to clothe ourselves with Yeshua's love. Give up the quarreling. Give up the fighting. Give up the jealousy. Come together as a community and do great things for God, because the time is really short. Yes, Paul was controversial in his day, and some of what we just read might stir up some strong feelings in some of us here. But let's remember that Paul was particularly chosen by the Messiah to bring the Lord's message to the known world. And we just read his thoughts and want to attempt to let them affect us, don't we? We want to submit to Rabbi Saul, Rabbi Shaul, the Apostle Paul's apostolic authority. That means he was made an apostle by the Messiah, a special chosen one, the apostle by the Messiah, and he was given authority to preach these messages. So let's try hard, even though we may not understand and we may not even like hearing about this, submitting to authority, the principle of authority, where does it come from? We may not like that, but we're called to submit to the teachings of this apostle, this one sent to us, the Shaliach, Rabbi Shaul, the Apostle Paul, messenger of the Messiah. Sound good? Let's stand together and say Aleinu, which is an affirmation of our calling and a commitment to the Messiah himself. Peace.